Welcome to the Palladium Podcast, Episode 3. I'm Jonah Bennett, Editor-in-Chief of the magazine.
Hey everyone, I'm Milton, Managing Editor.
And I'm Tivy, Editor.
This week, we're going to be joined by Miguel Morel, who wrote the recent on-the-ground Venezuela article for Palladium. But just before we get into that interview, we're going to do our classic question of the week.
Very traditional.
Very traditional. We always have readers email in what they'd like to hear us talk about. So this week, it's going to be Andrew Yang's presidential run, and basically regarding his UBI proposal. What would you spend your Yang bucks on? Your $1,000 a month.
Okay, so as a good millennial, I would spend it on traveling because experiences and pictures of me touching elephants cannot hyperinflate.
Okay, Wolf?
To be honest, I'd have to spend it on food and clothing for my family.
Okay, that's modest. That's a good goal.
And saving, of course.
Yeah. I'd probably spend it on buying a tiny house in Alabama so I could sustain my Guild Wars 2 addiction indefinitely. Miguel?
Honestly, I'd probably buy some Bitcoin to hedge against the money that's coming off the printing press.
Okay, that's fair enough. But that's enough of that. Let's get on to the next topic, the actual interview itself. Miguel, could you just introduce yourself to our listeners a bit with about a 30-second autobiography?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Miguel Morel. I'm a tech entrepreneur who currently lives in the Bay Area. I spend my time working on a company called Reserve. We're essentially trying to create a autonomous collateral-backed currency that could work as a substitute for currencies for countries with a failed monetary policy. So essentially being able to offer an alternative store of value and means of exchange for people who are living under hyperinflation, and also businesses who are doing foreign exchange, foreign transactions, and also treasury management in currencies that are depreciating very rapidly.
Excellent. Thanks for that intro. Well, let's get started with the piece itself. Obviously, it's a fantastic read, very stylistically well done. Can you tell us all the countries you ended up going to?
Yeah, so during my trip in South America, I spent probably about 10 days in Argentina. And then I also spent roughly the same amount of time in Colombia. And both of those times I was in the capital, which are Buenos Aires and Bogotá, respectively.
And why don't you tell us some of the interviews you had in Argentina? Let's start with Argentina, and get some background of your experiences there.
Yeah, sure. So Argentina is an interesting place. So within Argentina, there's been a lot of inflation for the past roughly 2 decades, and there's an interesting thing, which is that it also has very high capital controls. That's something that you tend to see in a lot of these countries. But recently, President Macri, who's a more conservative president who tends to be against capital controls, has essentially relieved the country of a lot of those practices, and now has essentially said it's fine to hold U.S. dollars. So you go to Argentina, you go to a street called Calle Florida, and you'll see a whole bunch of people who, like they're selling drugs or something, are just on the corners, everywhere on the street, yelling "dólares, dólares," essentially, dollars, dollars, and they just have stacks and stacks of bills and dollars and euros and Brazilian reals that they can sell to people in exchange for Argentine pesos. So I basically got to go and meet with some of those people and try to understand more about what it is that they're doing in order to combat the hyperinflation scenario. And along the way, I met a lot of people who left Venezuela for a better life in Argentina, and have now, with all of their expertise in how to handle deflating or inflating currency, have been able to make small businesses out of that.
Actually, that was one of my favorite interviews in the story itself. The woman you spoke to in Argentina, and how she escaped Venezuela. Actually, could you recount that?
Yeah, sure. So, while I was in Argentina, you sort of go, you don't really know anyone, and then you start meeting people, you talk to your Uber drivers, et cetera. And what I noticed is that they're really happy to tell you their story and, make introductions to other people. So, while I was there, I got to talk to, one of the Uber drivers, and he essentially told me that he had a friend who had come from Venezuela. I was telling him I was interested in interviewing them. And he put me in contact with her on WhatsApp, and then we got to meet at a restaurant, and she told me her story, and essentially the way she described it was that Venezuela was a great country to be in. She absolutely loved it, and then things just sort of started to collapse all around her. So while she was there, she decided that the thing to do was, instead of holding Venezuelan bolivars, the thing she wanted to do was leave her job and instead become employed as a contractor for an international business from the United States. And that way she could get paid in US dollars, so in a way where her currency wouldn't rapidly devalue. So what ended up happening was she ended up applying, she got the job, and then from there, she started doing business development work and getting paid in US dollars. And during that time, she wanted to save enough money to be able to get her, I think her sisters and her mother out of the country. And then, one day she was just walking in the middle of the shopping center in downtown Caracas, and she bought an ice cream cone for herself. And then as soon as she turned around, someone was behind her and, pointed a gun in her face, and told her, give me the ice cream. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but this is the world that they're living under. So after that, she gave it up. She went home and she packed all her things and said, I'm getting out of here. I'm going to Argentina. And then I'll send as much money as I can, and then I'll get you out later. And so she did. She went on the long road there.
Wait, so when the ice cream cone was lifted off of her, had she already licked it?
I mean, I have no idea. We didn't go into that much detail. I was more interested in how she actually got out of the country.
Measuring desperation levels.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That was the point of the question.
Used ice cream cone.
Yeah. Just to be clear, used ice cream cone.
Okay,
Yeah. So
okay.
I was more interested in how the hell she even got out of the country.
Right. So let's move to Colombia. You were there at the refugee camps in Bogotá.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to hear your interactions with the refugee in particular who had a run-in with the Chavista paramilitary.
Yeah, sure. So as I explained in the piece, when we got to the refugee camp, it's sort of like walled off, though not with walls, with fences, and then they sort of like have tarps that don't allow you to see on the inside. There's only one entrance to the camp, and it's by like steel door that's protected by guards. So as soon as I got out of the taxi, I sort of got swarmed by a whole bunch of people who were, interested in whether or not I had any food for them or whether or not I had clothing. I mean, relative to the other people in that general area, I was, well dressed and didn't look like one of them, of course. So I went up to the door and I go inside, and the guards are, they're basically, we're having a negotiation about whether or not they'll let me in, et cetera. And then eventually I'm like, all right, whatever, I'll just talk to the people outside. So I go outside, and, the person who stood out the most, of course, was, the man he was missing a leg. I mean, he was on crutches. And so I went up to him and I, asked him if he'd be willing to, tell me a bit about how he got to the camp and, what he's doing right now. And he basically told me his story. And in essence, the story is he lived in the province of Maracaibo in Venezuela, and essentially he worked for a local opposition leader. He mentions his name. I don't really remember, but he said that he was just warned so many times by family members and friends, and then one day he was driving back. He had actually dropped off his boss. He dropped off his boss at his house. And then he started driving back home. Eventually, he was going down one of these roads without any lights. The infrastructure was already decaying at the time. And then a car pulled up in front of him as he was driving, and he stopped, of course. and then they ambushed his vehicle.
I just wanted to add, it strikes me with that incident, right? Because we didn't really get in the piece to say, I think, was this one of the colectivos or not, but the fact that this level of conflict on the streets between normal people is happening, right? We discuss how it's like highly unlikely that these groups are going to back any kind of American-backed government, right? If that scenario unfolds, and like this is why how you can't just make peace with your neighbors that easily when this is the sort of conflict that's been going on with them over the years.
Yeah, it's not like the police are in control of the country and you can just give them different orders or something.
Yeah, and I mean the police as well have been on one, they've been on a side throughout all of this, right? So I saw people on social media responding to the piece, commenting on this incident in particular, and it just goes to it sort of goes to show just the day by day level of conflict going on.
Yeah, it shows you sort of like who's actually exerting the force, right? So there's a central operation that's happening with the Maduro regime, and then basically in the piece we go through how there's more of a decentralized network as well of different paramilitary officers who those are the people who will exert force. It doesn't necessarily have to be people in uniforms, right? It could be colectivos, someone on a motorcycle wearing camo. It's quite decentralized, and speaking to a couple different people there, there's one thing that's made clear, which is a lot of the time it doesn't matter. It's not like America where you go from New York to Philadelphia to Boston, and that there's going to be some sort of centralized network of Boston PD, NYPD, Philadelphia PD. In some parts of Venezuela, it's just whoever's around, right? It's just whoever can have the most arms and exert the most force. So it's not necessarily the most safe place.
Yeah, and I remember in the piece we had cited, I think it was the New York Times, saying around 10% of the cities in Venezuela are actually just under the control of the colectivos or one or another of these armed groups, right? Not even the Venezuelan state proper.
Yep.
Well, this is interesting. It sort of gets into one of the big weaknesses in the American regime building schemes, which is like America's military has been quite good at, toppling a centralized regime and taking over such things, or like, supporting an alternative party within a generally functional regime. But I can't really think of any examples where the U.S. has successfully managed to go into a place where the regime kind of doesn't really exist or isn't really in control and actually build order or even succeed at pacifying the place.
Because this is the ongoing problem, right? That the U.S. is very good at like leveling a regime, but they aren't actually able to do state building afterward. Libya, Iraq, Syria.
If there's some central target, it's like, okay, well, the U.S. military can cut the head off whatever the thing is, but if it's actually not, shaped like Germany in World War II, then they don't really know how to deal with it. And like you notice this in the Iraq War, like we treated Saddam's thing that way, right? It's like, okay, we go in, we bomb the hell out of their military, we bomb the hell out of all their stuff, we find Saddam, we execute him. We break up their regime, and then we're like, all right, now what?
Yeah,
and we don't really have praxis for that.
Everyone who actually sort of knows how to run the country, right? The de-Baathization project that they had there.
I think in this case, potential threats of a U.S. invasion of Venezuela are just more or less saber rattling and playing to domestic politics. Because there's sort of an ideological antipathy between the two systems, in the U.S. I guess can't show any weakness vis-a-vis Chavismo, so they have to pretend as though there's a live possibility that they might in fact invade Venezuela, when I don't think that's really a live option at all. And just in case though, we made sure to do some military analysis of what it would look like to do an actual perhaps an amphibious landing in Venezuela, and then a toppling of the regime, which of course could be done, but then there's the question of sorting out the rest of Venezuela, which, as we've noted, is much of it's controlled by warlords at this point in thick jungle. And so in terms of just looking at the situation in national interest, it's not exactly clear why we would care to do that. The oil is not the greatest quality. There's a lot of it. It's not the greatest quality. It's much more difficult to extract. The humanitarian case, I suppose, is interesting, but then again, there are humanitarian reasons for probably invading much of the world, because much of the world is run by incompetent governments. So then it's
Well, the other thing is the humanitarian case, of course, only works out if you can actually set up a better regime, and so far, like, the humanitarian case for the last few U.S.-led invasions has just not panned out.
Not at all. No.
Yeah,
And
they rather give up the land to rebels, ISIS, etc., as opposed to, they never actually set up a functional regime.
Yeah. There was actually a question I had for you, Miguel. So in the piece, you talk about how in these like currency exchange networks, you talk to people, and sort of in the broader people who've left Venezuela, you were talking to people who were very anti-Chavez, but you also interviewed a Chavista. So it's interesting that you have, American coverage, Western coverage, it focuses on this like ideological bent to the conflict that's happening there. But just like in the piece, we talk about how some of the state crises that are happening have afflicted multiple successive governments. The way that citizens are actually routing around those problems, it's interesting to me that includes people from the various political factions in the country itself. And I'm just interested to hear, given that you have these like Chavistas, these anti-Chavistas, does this ideological stuff even seem to come up from from the interactions you had when they're doing business, so to speak, when they're just engaged in these ventures to route around government failure?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I don't think let's see. Yeah, so they're basically all in it together, I think, is the main point. So when you talk to them about what's actually going on in their country, the ideology stuff comes later. They're more interested in letting the place is completely destroyed, the infrastructure is failing, the money doesn't work. Preserving enough money to feed yourself, that doesn't just divide along party lines. It's sort of just, we're all in this together. And just yesterday and today is when I saw the headlines. All of Venezuela just, all the electricity is cut off. At that point, it doesn't matter whether or not you're a Chavista, whether or not you're pro-US, whether or not you're pro-Maduro. It just doesn't matter. You just don't have any electricity. There's no air conditioning, and everything is terrible. At that point, I think, at that point, you're just trying to survive. So I didn't quite see any sort of like battles or arguments between Chavistas and non-Chavistas, especially like within the refugee camps. It was just sort of like, how are we going to make enough money to survive and then be able to send remittances back home to our families? And then the ideology stuff sort of comes later.
This was interesting. So regarding the electricity, there's the question of whether it's a random equipment failure, whether it's sabotage, whether it's incompetence. And I wouldn't necessarily immediately write off the sabotage angle. And I think this came up in your interview with Victor, the Chavista, who blamed the U.S. for a lot of the problems in Venezuela. And so some amount of that is cope for the incompetence of the Maduro regime, clearly. But also, it's not like he's wrong to be paranoid. I think we shouldn't write off that paranoia, because it just is the case historically that the U.S. has run an extremely high number of covert operations in South America, and it does so frequently, and I'm sure it does so to this very moment. And in fact, we are interfering in Venezuela quite aggressively. It's going so far as to cut off access to Venezuela's foreign gold reserves in the Bank of England, as was noted in the piece. And so, yes, there's paranoia, but it would be wrong, I think, to write it off as just like pure schizophrenic rambling or something, because when you don't know exactly where the U.S. is intervening, but you know that they're intervening in some number of objects within some overall set, then you tend to overfit and perhaps overestimate the amount of foreign intervention. And so you sound a little bit crazy, but there is a clear kernel of truth there.
Yeah, so one interesting thing here is immediately after the blackouts happen, Maduro goes on Twitter and on national television. He's like, "The United States did this," and then there's now a Twitter war. It's like Secretary Pompeo goes on Twitter. He says, the power outages. This isn't because of the U.S. It's not because of Colombia. It's not Brazil or Europe or anywhere else. This is the Maduro regime's incompetence. And in a certain respect, he's right, but I definitely don't think that we should be writing off the paranoia. On the other side, I also spoke with some refugees who had insight into the problems with infrastructure in Venezuela. And one of the things that I was told was that one of the refugees within his native town, he remembered that there would be these gangs of people who would go around essentially tearing down all of the wiring and all of the electric infrastructure for the town. They would break it off, cutting off all electricity to the town, and then they would basically take all of the scrap metal, the copper, etc., and then sell it across the border in Colombia for money. So it could be that a lot of people, of course, this is a nationwide outage, but definitely, I would not be very surprised if this meant that there were groups of people who are now taking apart centralized infrastructure that provides power to a lot of Venezuela in order to get some money on their hands by selling the scrap metal for cents on the dollar.
And interestingly enough, that's also a problem in the U.S., stripping infrastructure for copper, for example. The difference, of course, though, is that I think we have a fairly strong and robust centralized enforcement object. So we actually have the ability to clamp down on that and prosecute, whereas in Venezuela, I think a lot of parts are just up in the air, up for grabs.
Right. And like I mentioned in the piece, with some of these places, I mean, the people are just straightforwardly trading in gold. It could be that taking all the electric wiring just means, there's the equivalent of dollars in there, So sometimes it might make sense to actually just go and take it all down, even if it means you won't have electricity until someone fixes it.
Yeah, after endless bleeding about hyperinflation scenarios in the U.S., it's always interesting to visit a country where that's actually been realized, where there actually is hyperinflation and all of the different scenarios of trading in gold, trading in Bitcoin, trading in Litecoin, and all of these, basically any other random cryptocurrency that's almost valued at nothing would actually make sense as a medium of exchange in Venezuela, which goes to show you how bad the Maduro government has been doing in terms of engendering trust for its governance, and even their attempt at a state-backed cryptocurrency to sort of undercut some of these transactions, it hasn't gone well at all. If Miguel, if you want to speak to the cryptocurrency, the Petro, that would be useful.
Yeah, of course. So, in terms of the usage of Bitcoin and whatnot that I've seen, one thing that stands out is that within Venezuela and within Argentina, so these places that are actually experiencing hyperinflation, one of the main problems is that they also might not have access to internet, for example. So with something like a cryptocurrency, there's a question of whether or not they even have the relevant infrastructure to where if they had all of the money on their computer or on their cell phone or something, whether or not the infrastructure is in place for them to be able to successfully continually use that. There is one thing of note, though, which is that their expertise about cryptocurrency is much better than what it is in the West. Within Argentina and lots of Venezuelans that I met, they essentially had all heard of cryptocurrency. They may not have known specific names. A lot of them knew about Bitcoin and Ether, and surprisingly, even in the case of Venezuelans, Dash. And they were very knowledgeable as to the fact that it was digital money. It didn't have any government backing. that sort of thing. But they were extremely skeptical of the petro, and the main reason is because the government has screwed them over on so many other things. Why would they not try to screw them over with the new currency? So even with the old, they couldn't even get the old currency to work, and that was just printing money. So when they hear that the government has successfully created some sort of crazy alien algorithmic backed stablecoin, it just doesn't make any sense to them. So they're rightly so. They're highly skeptical of anything that the government is promoting, including the petrodollar.
As usual, I think this proposal does make some sense in the abstract, especially if you're trying to maintain a measure of autonomy and circumvent U.S. sanctions and trying to avoid using U.S. influenced international financial systems like SWIFT for high volume transfers. But of course, I think the problem here, like in many other domains the government has touched, not only did Venezuela require outside help to develop the cryptocurrency from the Russians specifically, but the execution seems particularly incompetent. So I would say, they have a lot of the right ideas, but the problem is that their ruling class is so it's degenerated to the point where they're unable to pull themselves out of the mess they're in. So maybe prospects for outside intervention or coups aren't particularly high, but I would be curious to brainstorm on internal scenarios of reform to restore trust in the government.
Well, one of the things that I think is worth mentioning here is like the case for cryptocurrencies as a state currency doesn't really make sense. The point of a state currency really is that you can have independent monetary policy, basically that the monetary policy and the capital flows are going to be controlled by a central actor. And the point of a cryptocurrency is that you have, a fixed monetary policy, like, for example, a fixed inflation, or like Bitcoin, no inflation, and that no one can control the capital flows. And so so the sort of the thing that I think is happening with the state cryptocurrencies is probably just, someone's getting scammed there, and someone's trying to scam someone. It's unclear like how many people are. There's probably sort of more people trying to scam someone than just like the one. Like, maybe the Russian guys who help out Venezuela are actually just like, a bunch of Russian hackers, and they're just, found a business opportunity to, do an ICO in Venezuela's name, and like the Venezuelan state's trying to scam the people. And, the thing doesn't really fundamentally make sense. So a lot of the players are just going to be kind of sharks. And so the interesting thing there, though, is the comment about a country like Venezuela wanting to break out of U.S. controlled traditional financial infrastructure. And that's something where a cryptocurrency might actually make sense. But in that case, you'd want to go for an established cryptocurrency or something that's really competently executed and proven, rather than trying to spin up some new thing. Like if you're spinning up some new thing, the overwhelmingly likely case is you're just trying to get free money out of an ICO, which I don't know if this is what the Venezuelan state was trying to do, but it seems very likely they kind of come up with this idea right at the height of the crypto bubble,
And currencies themselves, we can't forget that the currencies are sort of a lever of power for governments generally. So, for example, you could think of currency not only as a means to control what people can and cannot purchase within the economy within your own bounds, but keep in mind that the government also has the power to limit the amount of external currency that you're actually bringing into the country through capital control. So, one interesting thing that comes to mind here is lots of different African countries, for example, like Angola, in order to prevent people from bringing in external currencies that might cause their currency to inflate or devalue, they put capital controls on the amount of money that you can actually bring into the country. So you can imagine lots of different Chinese companies who are looking to do foreign direct investment into Africa, part of their new One Belt, One Road project. They want to, help and develop tons of infrastructure for the relevant African countries. And then as they're bringing money into the country, since the only way, the government says you're not allowed to purchase things within Angola using Chinese yuan or US dollars. You have to spend your local expenses in Angolan kwanza. Where's the way you get Angolan kwanza? Well, it's through the central bank. They're the ones with this printing press. So, you as a Chinese company, you're looking to do foreign direct investment, and then they give you a really terrible rate on the Angolan kwanza that they're printing for you in order for you to spend it. So that in a way is a revenue stream for the central banks and the governments, because they can then take the currency they got with a really great exchange rate from their perspective, and then turn around and sell it for currency that is in kwanza at a much better price. So by implementing, you're right in that by implementing some sort of centralized cryptocurrency, you're removing one of the levers of power for them.
Well, and it also seems like, because as we were chatting, right, there've been several countries which have thought about or tried to roll out some kind of state-backed cryptocurrency, but it also just doesn't seem to be the case that the actual incentives for people to make the jump to implementing crypto in a business or just start using it exist when it's a state-backed cryptocurrency.
Yeah, well, it doesn't really make any sense, right? Like, because the reason you would jump to a cryptocurrency is because it's got superior store value properties or something, like no inflation, right? And the reason a state would come up with a cryptocurrency is, well, so they can do things like print money. So, yeah, I think the whole concept is kind of like a little bit confused, and that's why I sort of started talking about scams there, because when you have confused concepts, that's where scams start to happen.
Do you not see a use case for the cryptocurrency being the unit of account for a non-Western banking system?
So yeah, so there is this other scenario, which is what I was talking about with the externally origined cryptocurrency. Like, let's say Venezuela wanted to regain trust and kind of get its financial situation under control outside of the U.S. Financial system. So, like, I know Bitcoin. Miguel can tell us a little bit about Reserve, but in the Bitcoin case, like what they could do is they say, okay, well, now we're going to start using Bitcoin. Bitcoin is our money. It's outside the U.S. financial system. It's got its issues, but we're going to make a big bet on Bitcoin that this will help make us rich or something. So they make a big purchase into Bitcoin. They start using Bitcoin. The thing that does is let's say you had like a really competent core leadership, and they wanted to get the rest of the state in line in Venezuela. I don't think this is actually the case, but this is like Bitcoin is sort of one of the things that could help with this, because what Bitcoin does is it really removes a huge piece of like the dimensionality of the problem. It's like when you have a failed state or a state that has internal conflict, which is very often the case, it's not necessarily the case that you actually want to maximize the power of the state. Like it's not necessarily the case that the core executive wants to maximize the power of the state. Often what they're interested in is reducing the dimensionality of the problem so they can maximize the coherence of the state. And I think things like Bitcoin, by just being completely impervious to like corrupt manipulation. Now, I don't know if Bitcoin is the best example of this, but as a general class of tactics, if you can switch the whole dynamic of the system to something where you have you're reducing the dimensionality of the problem, you're reducing some whole dimension of corruption, a bunch of your internal enemies in the state lose power, the state becomes more coherent, the state becomes more trustworthy because it no longer has these sort of vectors of abuse. And that can actually be good for even the central actor within the state in cases where you have the state is actually a little bit incoherent and its primary interest is regaining coherence. So I think that's an interesting use case for things like Bitcoin in Venezuela for the Venezuelan state. But I don't know if Bitcoin is necessarily the best thing there. There's still like a lot of uncertainties and so on. That would be a big bet. But yeah, Miguel can tell us about Reserve, which I think is also aimed at this problem.
Yeah, so with us, essentially, the main thing we're trying to create is just a decentralized version of something similar to Bitcoin that just doesn't have the volatility. So, like I mentioned in the piece, there's sort of like an established, what are the things that a currency needs in order to actually reach the mass adoption and, store of value, unit of account, means of exchange, all the things we've discussed in the episode. These things are incredibly important. And something like Bitcoin, I've heard the Bitcoin maximalist arguments. I can buy into the fact that in many years to come, there will be a demand for sort of like a decentralized currency, and hopefully it won't be as volatile once we Bitcoin max and Bitcoin's at $1 trillion. But until then, there's going to be lots of places with failed monetary policy, such as Venezuela, where before hyper Bitcoinization, they're going to need an alternative. And since the government's blocking the stable currencies such as the euro or the US dollar, the way they can get their hands on that will be through the internet. And right now, cryptocurrencies are just too volatile for them to want to use. But something like a more decentralized stable currency, I think could be the proper solution here. And let's not forget that even a country like Iran, once it was cut off the SWIFT network, they also came out with their own, Iran coin or whatever. So it seems like a kind of like a retaliation, if you will, for a lot of these different countries to be able to create their own cryptocurrency. But really, it's just sort of like a digital issuance of their own currency, akin to like, a number you see within Chase Bank or something. It's not actually decentralized.
Right. Yeah, in the Iran case. But whereas I think, again, the important thing in the Venezuelan case or other countries with a failed monetary policy or like a failing state is like, if you're the central government there and you really want to get a handle on the situation, it can be rational to reduce the overall power of the state, but make the state more controllable, more centrally controllable. And that's where things like cryptocurrencies can come in interesting ways.
That, I think, gets us into the question, right, and which we addressed in the piece near the end, right, the more fundamental question of whether the Venezuelan state structure and the people manning it, what is the competency, where are the failure modes? Because if you look at any individual program, right, that the Venezuelan state has, be it state-controlled oil or social programs or things like this, there's plenty of examples that you can find of any one of those that are done successfully and without this failure mode. And so Venezuela has this convergence in a way of both its geopolitical position and the ideological stance it takes toward the United States, and then this total systematic mismanagement that went on, this oil dependency and so on. All of these things can converge together to create this current meltdown and this economic crisis. And near the end of the piece, right, we have this brief discussion about, is it possible, right? Because the Venezuelan regime, based on its ideology, its key mission, insofar as you can talk about it having one, is maximizing independence from the United States. And even within the Chavez era itself, if you look at Chavez's early rhetoric versus the mid-2000s, the socialist elements come in a few years in, and they're justified on the grounds of this kind of national sovereignty idea, and this Bolivarian mission that he invoked for himself on his road to power. And it basically opens up the question, right? Is it actually possible for Venezuela to do that? Can it be a sovereign state somehow that isn't ultimately just under US influence? And essentially within Latin America, right, you can maybe think of Cuba that has sort of done that at the cost of being quite isolated in a lot of ways and under embargo, and its economic development has been stifled. But it is theoretically possible that a government could say, fine, that's the cost, or that's the price we'll pay. So I'm interested, Miguel, in your reflection. Like, is it actually possible to build a state that is not part of the US liberal order global structure in a place like Venezuela?
Yeah, so I think the answer here is the short answer is yes. So if I break down my thinking on this, I'd say that it's sort of a situation where you kind of have to pick your poison. So if we think about the major superpowers out right now, it'd be, the United States, Russia, and China. And from those, you can sort of pick your poison, pick your block, whether or not you want to be in the Russia sphere of influence, which is sort of now being taken over a bit more by the United States sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, or whether you want to be sort of under the Chinese sphere of influence and pressure exerting there. You can sort of even see the areas where China and the United States are battling it out. One of these battlegrounds is Taiwan, and it's not with aircraft carriers. I mean, sometimes it is, but more like, we're building artificial islands here because this is our territory, and then the U.S. parks a massive destroyer like a couple miles away or something. So you sort of have to pick what it is you want. But the two options I see here is, if you want to maintain autonomy outside of U.S. influence, you either have to be the superpower itself, i.e. Russia or China, or you have to be isolated like one of these other countries who aren't superpowers but have some sort of sense of autonomy. Off the top of my head, for example, Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, etc. But of course, they're incredibly socially isolated. The United States imposes sanctions and limits trade to these countries, and that's sort of the trade-off you have to make. It's essentially quality of life or autonomy.
Yeah, and it's worth noting Chavez himself had, I think it was near the end of his government, before he died, he had tried to start building up the Chinese relationship. But, we saw when Maduro took over how dependent Venezuela actually still was on the United States, right? Despite these 10 and more years of anti-American rhetoric. And we sort of point this out in the piece as well, right? Venezuela was in this position where they were politically opposed to the United States, but economically entirely dependent on them. And that in and of itself is, I would say, an example of incompetence, or at least unwillingness to take the steps necessary given this mission that they were making the basis of their legitimacy.
So I've got actually one last question for Miguel here. When you were interviewing Venezuelans in Colombia and Argentina, did you get a sense of how bought in they were to the idea of Venezuelan independence vis-a-vis the U.S. and were they cognizant of how porous the state is with regard to other countries? I mean, maybe the conceit is that from their perspective, Venezuela is free of U.S. influence, or trying to be free of U.S. influence. But it's very clear that the state is very porous to China, to Russia, and in particular, what's usually underexplored is how owned Venezuela is by Cuba. I think a lot of people don't quite analyze that closely enough, except for, Foreign Affairs did a really excellent piece on that, which we linked. But Miguel, I'm curious about your answer on that.
Yeah, so the topic of independence didn't really come up except for the people who I interviewed who happen to be Chavista. So everyone else, they think the United States is great. I spoke with someone who, I mentioned, like, what is your what are you looking for? What are your goals? What is your dream? And essentially, he just said, I just want myself and my family to be happy. And right now, what my family wants is, if we had the opportunity, would be to just move to Florida. Like, I've been to Florida before. Like, this is someone who was able to travel internationally, and yet was still sort of like destroyed by the incompetence of the state. And they're very interested in just being able to, if not exporting the culture and the way of life to Venezuela, they're just interested in straightforwardly moving to the United States, or in one case, someone told me they had family in Switzerland, for example, where independence of their country and autonomy is not even on their mind. They see the United States, they see Europe, and they see a great society that has everything together and lives a really great life. And that's what they're looking for, essentially.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up the interview. Thanks, Miguel, for coming onto the show.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Well, I think we can move on to some discussion of the other articles we've since posted in between now and the last podcast. Ash, if you want to take over discussion of the piece we posted on Russia, that would be great.
Yeah, so this is the piece, How Russia Keeps Post-Soviet States in Its Orbit, published on February 20th. And this piece is interesting because it actually ties in, I think, to some of the same themes that Venezuela was covering. It obviously even came up in the discussion at the end there, right? Russia, even now, despite its weaknesses since the fall of the Soviet Union, has more or less maintained political autonomy from the United States, and that's only increased all throughout Putin's reign in that country. And so this piece basically looks at the situation with a bunch of Russia's neighbors, because when the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia immediately lost formalized direct control over a wide range of countries that were in the Soviet Union proper, and also then over a number of Soviet-aligned countries that weren't part of the formal structure. And obviously countries like Ukraine have been quite prominent in the media, but a number of others don't really get looked at. And so the piece was asking, what is the grand strategy that Russia is using to, maintain as much control as they can over this post-Soviet bloc? Because obviously certain countries, like the Baltic countries, immediately went over into the Western sphere. They only came under Russian control as a result of World War II, I believe. And so they never had this deeper connection or loyalty to Russia. And when the Soviet Union fell, right, there's always been discussion about what kinds of deals had been made. Had Russia been promised that the West wouldn't expand up toward Russian borders? Well, whatever the facts behind that might be, NATO and the European Union immediately started going eastward. And finally, Ukraine itself, right, which Russia is always viewed as either a part of Russia or at least, its backyard, a country that's rightfully in the Russian sphere, historically speaking. They'll sometimes say in the Russian world. Even Ukraine, a government took control in that country, which saw Russia as a primary enemy and wanted to become part of the NATO sphere, part of the EU sphere. And so there's some interesting things that come up in this piece which don't get discussed as much, some which have actually come up in news recently, like the union state between Russia and Belarus. So after the Soviet fall, Russia and Belarus actually signed this sort of treaty, which essentially the intention seemed to be that Belarus would ultimately become integrated into Russia, and it provided this framework for them to start integrating things like currencies. That's part of what's being discussed right now. But this was signed years ago, and in fact what's happened is that Belarus has tried to take a stance where they've generally been viewed, it's viewed as the last dictatorship in Europe and so on. But Belarus is increasingly suspicious of Russia and has been even more so since these incidents in Ukraine. So beyond that, there's been all these different institutions that have been thrown up over time and then gone defunct, where Russia and other countries in the sphere try to rebuild some of this Soviet bloc geopolitical power that existed in the past. And ultimately, the thesis of the piece is that what's ended up happening in practice is that because less countries were involved in that to begin with than were part of the Soviet bloc, Russia's power relative to its neighbors within these institutions was already greater than it had been in the Soviet Union. And especially after Ukraine, countries that hadn't already committed themselves to things like the Eurasian Economic Union were now pretty much committed to staying, to at least balancing power against Russia, to not getting absorbed any further into the Russian sphere. And essentially, Russia's position now seems to be one where they're trying to consolidate power over these areas that they've managed to make, to either have them commit themselves to Russia, places like Kazakhstan, or at least keep them isolated, as with some of the other countries in the region, so that they don't go over into Western control. And that, ultimately that's the piece's focus. So if we wanted to open that up to discussion, because the comparison to Venezuela here obviously is that Venezuela, some overtures aside to places like China, did not join any kind of geopolitical bloc. But in this case, Russian power is to an extent actually alienating countries from making any kind of change in that sort of loyalty, even if maybe in terms of social values, right? They're still more similar to Russia, say they're more socially conservative. So we can open that up to discussion.
Well, to go back to something you said earlier, I think perspectival thinking is always helpful. Regardless of, as you said, regardless of whether there was an agreement or not about U.S. and NATO expansion eastward, closer to Russia's borders and sphere of influence, it's almost immaterial at this point, what the agreement said or whether there was one at all. I probably have the opinion that there was, in fact, an agreement not to push really far eastward, but that's immaterial. If you imagine Russia parking an aircraft carrier off the coast of California, and there was some debate about whether we had participated in an agreement or not, I think that's basically irrelevant. The fact is, no serious great power is going to put up with an aircraft carrier that close off of their coast. And it's always funny to read press releases from the Pentagon about the interaction of their forces with Russia's planes. Like, you'll have right near the borders, the Pentagon will be complaining about Russian aircraft buzzing their ships. And
the ships are in the Black Sea.
Why
exactly. Are the ships in the Black Sea?
And it would be very strange if that were to happen off the coast of California. And our first point would be how could normal Russian people be duped by Russian government press releases that their innocent ship off of the coast of California had been buzzed by like horrible and evil, oppressive U.S. aircraft, and yet many people buy that same explanation when it comes from the Pentagon. So clearly, there is some amount of popular trust in what the Pentagon says still. With regard to that spin, it just goes to show you how effective PR is still.
Yeah, and I mean, let's be a little bit nuanced here with like people sort of just slavishly believe the propaganda that comes out of the American imperial state, but like that doesn't mean we should or in calling that out and in taking note of the fact that like the situation's a little bit absurd and the propaganda's a little bit absurd, like this doesn't mean we're necessarily we shouldn't be necessarily opposed to the actual situation there, because it's like, look, we're Americans. It actually maybe does make sense. Maybe if we think America is maybe too aggressive towards Russia or whatever, but like, there is this point where it's like, yeah, we do want our aircraft carriers up in their business, making sure they know who's boss at some point. But like, it's just kind of weird that like somehow the American discourse is such that we can't just say that. And like that can't just be the line. It's like, yeah, we're over there in the Black Sea because America is extremely powerful and these guys are like defying us, right? And so we're gonna do an equivalent of parking an aircraft carrier off the coast of California.
It's not only America though that has the PR problem here. So there's something that strikes me in this piece is how, given Russia's, let's call it, delicate position, right, where they're trying to get allies to commit themselves to mutual investment and economic building up, countries that have other options, right? So Kazakhstan, for example, we've done a piece on them as well. They have this Russian relationship, but they've also built one with Turkey, with China, even with the West. And there was this incident recently where Putin, I think after the Ukrainian crisis had broken out, so it was around 2014 or so, Putin was asked at an event whether Russia would ever consider similar actions against Kazakhstan. And Putin's answer was basically, well, Kazakhstan has never really had a state. It was Nazarbayev, the Kazakhstani president, who created it from nothing. And obviously, when Kazakhstan heard that answer, they immediately went on sort of geopolitical red alert. They reasserted, we have the right to quit the Eurasian Union. We will never accept threats to our independence. And this is similar to what happened with Belarus in that it was after this rhetoric was coming out of Russia that Belarus started actually looking back at Europe and at least trying to thaw its relationship with them. And so Russia, there's sort of this ham-fistedness that they seem to be unable to avoid. Maybe they know something we don't, right? Because right now there seem to be actually positive meetings going on again between Russia and Belarus about increasing integration. But Russia is able to do what it does because it has a big landmass, it has this big military structure, it's retained and even rebuilt to an extent under Putin some of this state sovereignty that it clearly possessed as the second superpower in the Soviet era. But in terms of its sphere of influence, it has never regained all of that space. And the Russian position, as the piece points out, is essentially designed to that it can't expand any further than what it is now. Any country that's not already committed to Russia is either isolated or it's Western committed. No one's going to make that switch from Western commitment to Russia when they basically see that as an immediate threat to their sovereignty.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate on the question of empire that part of the reason is for the PR is that people in the U.S. seem unable or unwilling to conceive of the U.S. as an actual imperial power. And so there's that aspect, and then there's the aspect that according to, U.S. influenced international norms, being an empire and acting as an empire on the world stage is sort of like an illegitimate thing to do. It's not what you do. And so you basically have to reframe all of your active interventions in other countries according to some weird PR logic of defensive actions rather than aggressive actions, and so you never refer to it as like trying to extract tribute and subject your enemies to your own ideological system. That, of course, it's never how you really frame it, because if you were to frame it that way, if you were to frame a lot of U.S. actions in some sort of very, very cold and clinical way, then it would be very clear, I think, that it is acting as an empire. But of course, it doesn't want to obviously appear illegitimate according to its own standards. And so that's where the PR tactics come in. But, I'm not even talking about, I really am not that interested in the normative aspect of it so much. I'm not here to whine about the fact that the U.S. is an empire or something. I'm really just interested in the empirical question of when you look at the U.S.'s actions, their foreign policy actions, their track record over the past decade, their role in helping a lot of third world governments with training, quote unquote, training and advising, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on and on about that. And you look at just a basic world map of U.S. bases around the world. It's an empirical question: is the U.S. an empire or not? And I think it's not useful to obsess too much about the normative question, and just to say, yeah, I think based on all these facts, the best thing to do is just to admit that the thing is an empire. If the U.S. thinks it's in its interest not to say it's an empire, well, that's its prerogative, I guess. But it's incumbent on us to just call things as they are.
I mean, no country. Look, I'm sitting here recording from Canada, right? There was a famous quote a few decades ago from Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who was the prime minister at the time, saying that Canada's position was like a mouse beside an elephant, right? No country whose direct relationship is with the United States is any under illusion what the relationship is. And this comes out in like very funny and petty ways sometimes, right? Like, I personally think a lot of this animosity that you get in especially places like Canada as well, or in places like Britain, it's a sort of anti-Americanism that snipes at the U.S. as being, they'll look at it as, oh, it's less culturally enlightened or something. But it really is this sniping from a position of powerlessness that actually comes out very weak at the end of the day. And it's just whining it's whining by a usurped empire, essentially. There's something I wanted to say as well, which is that the U.S. party line, let's say that it's not an empire, it's just training and advising, we can actually see that probably undermines the US from actually being able to utilize their state building capacity to the extent that they perhaps could otherwise. Because something you see with Russia is that they are more willing to actually just go in and set up structures. So we have Kadyrov, for example, in Chechnya. There's also these breakaway states that are discussed in the piece itself. So there are 6 states which have they've declared independence, but they're unrecognized by pretty much everyone except Russia and each other. So these are Abkhazia, Nagorno-Karabakh, South Ossetia in the Caucasus, and you have Transnistria. And then we have the 2 in eastern Ukraine. So a total of 6 there. But none of these states are like necessarily well-run states, right? There's no economic miracle happening or anything. They're quite isolated. But it's worth noting that Russia's willingness to just go in and essentially treat them as Russian protectorates has meant that they haven't really been retaken, even in cases like where Georgia is a U.S.-aligned country. It's never retaken the breakaway regions, and those regions are still functionally under the control of Russian-aligned forces. Whereas the U.S., despite having probably far greater knowledge of how to properly structure and run a government, will not do stuff like that. And, maybe there's things like expense that come up as well. But if we accept that there's some amount of realpolitik going on behind conflicts like Iraq or Libya, like very just hard-nosed oil interests, well, presumably then having a stable government in those regions that's just like an American viceroy running it would be acceptable to those entrenched interests. And yet America doesn't do that. And it's interesting to, it's an open question how much of this is having to maintain this idea that it's not an empire, and how much is it just there's no coordinated effort within the U.S. government structure itself that's willing to take those steps.
Yeah, well, I want to say something more on this empire question, which is that, like, it's to admit to being an empire is really, it sort of really goes against the liberal ideology of the United States in a very deep way. Like we can't, like for this thing, this, whatever, this glorious society that we're at the top of, for it to be based ultimately on kind of like coercion and power, would be like that's just like unthinkable to liberalism. It's of course based on like enlightenment and philosophy and democracy and all these things, right? And so it's like we have this this self-conception as this democratic power and this imperial sort of reality, and these things can't really be reconciled, and so we get all these like extremely schizophrenic and often hilarious kind of attempts to deal with that sort of tension. But it's sort of interesting, like there's something deeply wrong if you can't admit to yourself what you are and what you're doing. Now, as for like which direction is correct or which direction you should go, I'm not going to comment on that, but there's probably some synthesis somewhere in between where it's like, all right, maybe we shouldn't be doing quite as much empire as we are, but maybe we shouldn't also be quite as uptight about this like, oh yeah, we're not doing empire thing, right? Like there's this, like if you had an accurate self-conception, that was in line with what you're actually doing, then that's like a much more orderly situation. Whereas if you can't even admit what you're actually doing, like you can't actually apply any ideals to it, right? You can't reason about it. You can't apply your ideology to it.
Yeah,
like
you can't even coordinate on the end goal.
Right, like you're not doing something coherent if you can't actually examine yourself honestly, and so I see that as sort of like one of the big problems that America faces is that like, well, there is actually a reality that has forced us to become something like an empire. Like it didn't just happen by accident. It didn't just happen because someone was evil or whatever. It happened because there's actually a reality to the question of empire that imposed itself on us. And like our ideology is unfit to deal with that reality, and it means that our empire is sort of incoherent and probably evil.
And so you can contrast the American strategies with the strategies of the British Empire, where the British Empire is something like, okay, we'll go into Egypt, late 19th century, early 20th century, we'll install basically what we would refer to as a dictator who has full control, and we'll have the eventual goal of transferring full power to the local government in maybe like 30, 50, 70, 100 years or something. Whereas the US will roll into Iraq and say, okay, we'll have basically the equivalent of some kind of a viceroy for like a year, and then we'll just like offload it completely onto whatever.
The international community.
Well, yeah, the international community or some fragile democratic state that we kind of magicked up in a year or two, or we had
essentially something similar to what was actually done with a lot of the post-World War II states that came under U.S. alignment, like Japan.
Correct. Right. So the typical thing is for each one of these states that we try and set up a new democratic regime in, there will be a few people of good quality who are U.S. educated and who abide by liberal norms, and we'll say, well, we'll just kind of parachute them in from Brooklyn or wherever, somewhere on the East Coast or something. We'll just parachute them, the kind of deep state there. We'll parachute them into Iraq, and we'll just see how that goes. And it seems to me that those people, despite having more cultural familiarity with the local situation, have the same blind spots that the rest of the U.S. statecraft apparatus has with respect to that country, and so they'll end up running elections, which does satisfy the international community, but it's unclear what that even means to anyone there, and certainly. In places like Afghanistan, elections, as far as people on the ground are concerned, a lot of people, because it's a sizable country, it's unclear that any of them care about elections as a means for legitimacy, and in fact, it's something they would probably reject. but it's our default assumption that in order for a state to be legitimate, it has to be via some sort of consent of the governed expressed via this sort of quixotic democratic ritual. So there's the problem. There's a couple problems there. The first being it's unclear that ought to be the only method of establishing legitimacy. And then second, I think for many people on the ground in Afghanistan, they would actually themselves reject that conception of legitimacy.
I think there was a final piece we wanted to discuss as well.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so I can talk a little bit about this. This was the Sonya Mann piece on gun control, printing guns, technology, the internet, and the whole cypherpunk thing. This was a really interesting article. Basically, I won't go into too much of what was said in the article, but there's this thing going on now, which is that you have these people basically trying to work on printing guns, or really digitized home manufacturing is kind of a term that I would use to describe this. Basically, that making stuff in your garage using kind of plans off the internet without high levels of expertise. And so 3D printers are obviously a huge part in this. Cheap CNC machines are a huge part in this. And so obviously one of the things you can make in your garage if you have such equipment is guns, or at least this is the idea. So people are trying to come up with plans and generally promote the idea of building guns using this digitized home manufacturing kind of stuff, with the objective of having like untraceable off the books guns that cannot be regulated by the government, or like can't be traced, or like can't be stopped or whatever. So there's this very like anarchistic confrontational rhetoric of like, yeah, the government can't stop us, we're going to print the guns. And so the piece is kind of commenting on first of all the background of that whole situation, with characters like Cody Wilson and Defense Distributed and the other guys who are working in this area trying to make this happen. So first of all, comments on that background, but then also takes note of the fact that like this could only ever fly in America. And if you really examine it, the rhetoric is, and like the conception of the sort of political battle that these people are engaged in is very much a legal thing, right? Like people are talking about using the First Amendment to safeguard the Second Amendment, right? These are not sort of abstract moral principles. These are laws, fundamental laws in a particular legal order of the United States. And the whole thing becomes court battles and so on, fighting over whether or not people are allowed to share the plans, or whether or not people are allowed to print the guns, and whether they have to register the guns, stuff like this. And so some of the things that have happened there recently are like a couple of years ago, California made it so that if you make these homemade ghost guns, which has always been legal in America, you've always been allowed to kind of make your own guns, and it's always been basically unrestricted, except I think you're not allowed to make fully automatic weapons, or like larger than certain calibers. I'm not sure what the restrictions are since like the 1930s, but you've always been allowed to make your own guns basically, and you never had to register them or anything like that. But California has recently made it so that if you make your own gun at home, or if you finish one of these 80% sort of guns, where it's mostly done and you just need to do a few manufacturing operations at home, so that you actually did at least technically make the gun yourself. They made it so that if you make a ghost gun, you have to register it. You have to like put a serial number on it, etc. So that's something that's happened recently. And Defense Distributed has started distributing their files again recently, I think. I'm not sure the details of all that. Anyway, so there's this very interesting background of kind of the cypherpunk movement crossing over with the gun people kind of movement trying to use technology and digitized home manufacturing to make gun control basically impossible. That's the rhetoric. But it ultimately comes down to being something of a legal battle. It's Cody Wilson himself is a lawyer. The thing is phrased and strategized and played in terms of legal battles. And so I thought that was a really interesting thing to point out. And so I was very happy to get this article where we had a chance to kind of comment on that part of the situation, that it isn't like, this isn't necessarily just technology has independent of the human order changed the landscape. It's not like if the government actually wanted to stop you from making guns and they were determined about this, they couldn't do that, right? Like they do monitor everyone's internet traffic. They do monitor everyone's purchases. The technology isn't actually there to make, a heat treated rifled barrel at home using digitized home manufacturing. You still have to buy that part online or at the store or whatever, and those parts could become regulated, right? There's all kinds of things that the state could do to step in and make home manufacturing of guns illegal. But what the home manufacturing does is it forces an issue, right? Which is it forces an additional legal complication of this overlap between free speech and the right to bear arms, I guess. And so it's part of this legal strategy to kind of force the state to change how it's doing the regulation. And it's part of a broader class of strategies. This is something that was mentioned in the piece, which is that you use kind of a technological vanguard to force some condition into existence or force some foothold that then becomes this legal test issue, and then you fight over that. It's sort of like you've got this technological foothold in the legal space that the state could come and crush, but now you've got like a place from which to fight the legal battle. And so it's this really interesting tactic that has been used all over the place. So cryptocurrencies are sort of doing this in the sense that they're forcing themselves into existence. They're using rhetoric like the state can't shut us down. But I think ultimately, if the state really wanted to, they could probably shut them down. But the existence of the cryptocurrencies now makes it very difficult. It means that now there's actually a legal battle to be had. Same thing with companies like Uber and Airbnb, where they kind of force themselves into existence. They're almost breaking the law at the beginning. And by the time the law catches up to them, they've got this foothold. And now it becomes a sort of fightable legal battle.
It strikes me that this is definitely a very American type of battle, as I think you were saying earlier, in that I think most countries, right, because even most English-speaking countries have some version of this tradition, right, of the free rights-bearing individual, and even some version of that individual being armed. But most other English-speaking countries, I think the discussion would go some iteration of, okay, let's look at the right to speech. The right to speech exists for a certain reason, say being able to express a political opinion, etc. Does it exist so that people can increase firepower in this way? And you'd sort of have a yes or no. It's interesting to me that in the U.S. itself, that the way the right is conceived of is in a way an end in itself, right? Where that discussion is actually precluded. So I definitely agree. This is a very American cultural problem and legal problem, even.
It's interesting, as you're saying, it kind of comes down to the sacralization of the Constitution in the United States, which is like the Constitution, given by these divinely inspired founders, has set out these inalienable rights that we must uphold, never mind why or for what purpose, right? And that creates this landscape on which you get these kinds of interesting political conflicts. So it's really the way I want to approach this discussion and this article. It's not like, oh yeah, this is a good thing or this is a bad thing, or we should print more guns, or we should somehow stop these people. But like, no, it's a very interesting and in many ways revealing type of political conflict, and it's an interesting tactic. And we can ask like, okay, well, is this kind of thing going to happen more? Where else can it happen? Is this peculiar to America, or is it something that could happen everywhere? Just like use it as a test case of like, let's try to understand the world through the lens of this issue. What can we learn? And I found it very interesting as like this example where politics and law and technology have all kind of bled into each other, and like, technology changes the landscape of possibilities a little bit, which makes it possible to like break edge cases in the law, which makes it possible to like fight political battles that previously weren't possible to fight. It's just this really interesting kind of interplay between those issues. And that's how I'm
I was going to say, obviously, if you're on the sort of crypto anarchist, your goal, you are weaponizing the First Amendment in terms of your goal actually being to radically limit and fracture the power of the state. But it also strikes me that if you look at this, say, in Venezuela, right? Let's say that opposition people in Venezuela started printing their own guns. By virtue, the same thing that makes this appealing to your crypto anarchist also makes it hard to like block anyone who's not ideologically aligned with you out of using it. So in that case, a state could as well share that same that same code. You can have your own supporters using the same technology and increase their firepower. So anywhere where there's a proxy conflict happening, right, it won't just be your anti-state types who are using this. American-backed rebel groups in any part of the world could use the same technology. So it's interesting that there are these ideological values being implicitly attributed to this technology, which don't seem to be at all apparent.
Yeah, well, I think like if a state wanted to arm its people, if you had kind of if you had a state that wanted to arm a bunch of its supporters,
Venezuela and the colectivos as an example,
right. If Venezuela wants to arm the colectivos, in that case, like the most efficient thing is going to be set up centralized manufacturing of high quality firearms, and because like it's actually just the economies are not there to be able to manufacture firearms at home. Like you can almost technically do some of the parts, and like you can make a working lower receiver for an AR-15 on a 3D printer or on a home CNC machine, but I've never heard of anyone doing a proper heat treated barrel and like the combustion chamber. What's that part of the gun called? But like those parts are, which are really, the actual heart of the gun is really the barrel, and that stuff is like very difficult to do on home machinery. You can't just print it because it needs like precise surface finishes and so on. And so that stuff, like sort of more centralized manufacturing would make sense for it. And so like this kind of gets into broader questions of like, will the digitized home manufacturing like generally decentralize manufacturing and take over things? And will we just like download all our products in the future and stuff? And I think the answer to that is no, because these advances in technology, they don't just serve the decentralized stuff. They also serve the centralized stuff, and the centralized stuff will always have better sort of economies of scale.
Yeah, better coordination.
But where this stuff can sort of make a difference is if the centralized manufacturing would get blown up because, you're actually, let's say the Venezuelan government's not on board and the colectivos want to arm themselves. Now, if they can sort of get a bit of machinery and do some stuff in their garage, get some plans, now they're able to do things like without necessarily the help of a state. But even that actually becomes, now that I think about it, like becomes difficult because you still have to get these like precise machines, which are 3D printers and CNC
there's a certain
machines
level of technological input that has to exist for this particular technology to be actually used. Because, I mean, it's already the case, the poorest countries in the world, you've always been able to traffic or send guns into those countries.
Yeah, I mean,
this is a technology that
hard
benefits people in advanced countries to an extent, or at least countries that have enough investment that like networks of people are using 3D printing and the sort of technology.
Yeah, I mean, like at the current level, to really deflate the whole thing, like as much as I think it's interesting to really deflate the whole thing, it's like what this technology is for is gun hobbyists in rich countries that have permissive laws and markets where you can buy all the hard to make gun parts. Like, in the United States, like the reason it's even possible to make an AR-15 at home is, well, first of all, an AR-15 is like Lego, right? It's got a bunch of different parts. They're all standardized. You just buy them and you put them together. But there's the one part that is technically the firearm, which is the lower receiver. And by technically, I mean legally. And that's the part that people are making at home because, to buy a lower receiver at a gun shop or online requires all kinds of registrations and background checks and et cetera. But you can make a lower receiver in your garage and then buy all the rest of the parts. But you still need this market support of like, well, can you buy a barrel? Can you buy an upper receiver? Can you buy like the handguard? Can you buy the trigger kit and all this other stuff that you're not going to make at home?
It's also unclear to me the point of a lot of this stuff beyond an interesting sort of like gun hobbyist experience. There's always the narrative that attracts people of some sort of like outlaw cyberpunk, don't tread on me sort of aesthetic, and that's very American in a sense, but that doesn't mean it's not LARP. For example, the reality is that really it doesn't matter the number of guns you have in your house. You're basically going to take state overreach without much opposition. For basically my entire adult life, if you're on the, sort of like gun hobbyist forums, there's endless talk of, if the government does this or if the government does that, there's going to be a redneck revolution or something. We're all going to get up, in our Ford F-150s and drive on Washington, D.C. And the reality is that that's not going to happen. There have been plenty of instances in U.S. history of strong federal government overreach. There hasn't been a successful coordinated pushback against that in any way. Nobody's drawing firing lines around their house to take down the government in any serious way that works.
Yeah, well, it's like even if you did, you're not self-sufficient enough to keep it up. Like the government can always just wait you out, right? It's like, we're not actually going to come get your guns. We're just going to make it illegal for you to hold them. And like if you ever step outside of your firing line and have to like buy something from the store, now good luck, citizen.
And that's exactly historically what we've seen, these people being waited out.
Yeah.
As usual, it'll be the French, and they'll do it with fistcuffs and Molotovs.
Well, anyways, I mean, there is one, not to be too down on this whole thing. Like, I think there are interesting use cases for these, like, ghost guns. And one of the things, one of the cases where I could see it being legitimately useful is, like, let's say I want an AR-15 in California. It's like, technically AR-15s are illegal or whatever, but AR-15 pattern rifles are fine. In California. So let's say I wanted an AR-15, I have to go through all this California paperwork. I have to like register everything. But if I make my own gun, I actually kind of don't really have to do that. Or at least until recently, you didn't have to legally. And now it's still like, it's unclear how enforced that law is going to be and like how at least how efficiently enforced. So it might not be that like, oh yeah, I'm going to go up against the government. It might not be that, but just like, look, I don't trust the California government and I don't want my name in some database somewhere as one of those hateful gun owners, right? But like maybe I still want to own a gun. And so like I could see it being useful as like this very low level form of like hedging against certain things. Like, okay, I just don't want to be in the database, you know? And that's something that like makes sense to me. Not like I'm going to fight the government, but I don't want to be in that particular database.
Yeah, I'm obviously, overcorrecting to make a point here, which is that in order to accomplish what it sets out to do, in 99% of cases, the government does not need to force a armed confrontation with you at your house, right? Like everything you would hope the government would, or the gun would protect against, the government does not need to come to your house with a gun at your head in order to, enact some policy change that it wants to do. Like whether it's seizing the gold or whatever, or just any number of policy changes.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, like to bring this back to the Venezuela thing and the Russia thing, it's like to really get to the level of guns against the U.S. government, what you're talking about is sovereignty, right? You're trying to build a sovereign country, and you're not just trying to build a sovereign country in South America or Asia or something with lots of other people and lots of capacity and so on. You're trying to build a sovereign country on the territory of the United States. In a sense, and like, good luck, man. Venezuela couldn't hack it. Like, and they have plenty of guns and plenty of all sorts of other stuff. Like they're just way more capable of this than like random Joe citizen is. So to like, I don't know, the bravado kind of rhetoric of like guns against the U.S. government, it just seems completely silly to me because. Like there are many dimensions of power, and to like become independent along all of them is to become sovereign. And like you're just not going to become sovereign on U.S. soil.
I want to plug our piece here on why political violence won't happen in America, which was an excellent overview of all of that.
Right. Well, yeah. Like that's another dimension of the problem is like, okay, well, to actually do this level of sovereignty, you'd need like. A whole bunch of people willing to use coordinated violence, and like that's not going to happen these days.
Yeah, in various standoffs that we've seen recently, it's kind of been comical. Like a quarter or half of the guys have been feds outright. A lot of them, when they're standing off with, say, the FBI or local police or something, they're busy doing like YouTube live streams. They lose in the end. The government gets what it wants. Maybe if they're lucky, there was like a procedural error or something, and so the case gets thrown out. But ultimately, like they don't accomplish really what they set out to accomplish, and certainly a lot of them have more lofty goals than just telling the government to piss off in one instance. Those never seem to come through, and a lot of them are often too individualistic to coordinate at a level where they could even aim to achieve sovereignty.
And to make some more comments on like the the fears people have about there's going to be all these ghost guns, all these criminals are going to have guns and shoot people and so on. It'll increase the number of gun deaths or whatever. I think those fears are actually overblown as well, just because for the same reason basically, which is this not going to happen at scale by like this gun printing thing. It's not going to happen at scale by by bad actors. It's too inefficient. It's not quite gonna work. And if the state really wanted to come after it, like it does not pose a real threat except in this sort of legal battle of like, should law-abiding people be allowed to own guns, etc. And so like there's sort of like the rhetoric from both sides on this issue, I think, is like quite overblown. And what I really see as the interesting core of the issue is that theoretical point of how these technological strategies can interplay with political strategies and legal strategies.
Yep. So I think that about wraps it up for that topic, meaning we are out of time for this episode. Thanks everyone for listening to the Palladium podcast, episode number 3, and it's time to sign off.
Yeah, I think we had a lot of fun this time. I really like this discussion.
Yeah, I'm very glad with the Venezuela piece that we got that out. I've had people coming saying it's one of the best pieces they've read on the topic. So thanks to Miguel and everyone else who worked on that one, and thanks for everyone for patching in.
Yeah, I mean, it better be the best on that topic because
this is Palladium.
This is Palladium.
Exactly.
Of course we were there. Of course we were there. All right. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next episode. See ya.